Hi, and thanks for joining me. I'm Susan from So Pieceful, and I like to keep my hands busy with a needle and thread. So I like to work on small projects that I can pick up and put down when I need to, and don't take up a lot of space. Today we're going to be working on a process called Boro. It's spelt B-O-R-O. It's a Japanese technique that traditionally involves repairing old clothing with pieces of fabric and stitching. And today we're going to work through this process on a project that involves some Boro, and that's this Cuppa Mug Rug, which is a pattern that's been designed by Natalie Bird of the Birdhouse. And I have it available for you, kitted up with the fabrics that are in this one and the ones that we're going to use today. So let's get started. If you've purchased the kit from us, you'll have received all the fabric that you're going to need and some embroidery thread, but there will be no needle in the kit. Now, if you've done any sashiko or embroidery in the past, I'm sure you've got a lot of needles that are suitable. If you don't, I do have the Bowen sashiko needles, which come in a range of sizes. So whether you use 1 strand or 6 strands of the embroidery floss, you'll have something that will work there. So what you're looking for is a needle that's long and sharp, and obviously will take as many strands of embroidery floss as you might like. If you're working with your own from your own stash, you'll have needle and thread that you'd like to coordinate with your fabric. So the fabrics that I've got are all cut into pieces. Now the purlin, I've given you a little bit extra. Now just on the purlin, you'll notice that it's got a bumpy side, and that is the fusible side, and it's got a flat side. Before you cut your purlin to suit the measurements that are given in the pattern, just have a think about the mug that you're going to be putting into your mug bag. What we're going to do then is to take our fabric. Now traditionally this fabric would be torn, and you'll notice that I've cut it because it's got a cut edge on it. However, if you would like to just give it a little frayed edge, it's easy enough just to pull off 1 or 2 threads from each of the sides or the pieces that you've got. And then it's just a case of laying the fabric out. Now, remember I said this side was the fusible side. So we're just going to lay our fabric out on the fusible side. And the way that you'll lay it out, you don't need to put one piece, all the pieces on top of each other. Some will go underneath, some will go on top. But I do like to spread them around so that you've got a good mix of colours. The small pieces, the smaller pieces, probably would put, so that they sit on top. Something that's a bit bigger might go underneath. And you will just continue to lay those out then until you're happy with the way they're laid out. Now, as you lay your pieces out, you will need to think about the overlap. So we would like to make sure that each piece has probably a 1/2 inch over the one that it sits on top or underneath. So don't be too stingy with your seam allowances, because once you stitch them down, you want to make sure that they're well covered. So I'll just go ahead and lay them out until I've got them in a design that I'm happy with. And it will mean moving some around, moving things into different places, but so that I've got a nice even spread of those colours and fabrics. Remembering that it will fold in half, so I'd like to make sure I've got a good representation of all the fabrics on both sides. So I've used most of them, and I've sort of laid them out so they're even spread. If you were to look at this one, for example, I've got them spread right across. Now, the thing that you'll notice, if we go back and have a look at our sample, is that there's a fabric that I've put in the kit for you for your binding and your handles, giving you a little bit extra of that one. And so what I've done when I've laid out my fabric on the purlin is made sure that I don't have the same fabric in the binding up against it. So in this one, the binding fabric will be this lime colour, and so I've kept that one in the centre. Once I was happy with the layout then, I actually went and gave it a press with the iron. Now, because that purlin was fusible, the pieces that are touching the purlin are adhered down to it, but the pieces that have got no purlin underneath it are still loose, obviously. And so we've got a couple of choices then. I find the Roxanne's glue, which comes both in bottles and this little dip and dab one. I can just use a bit of that to pop it down where I'd like it to sit. So once I've got that down, I don't need to do anything else to that. If you're not, haven't got any glue, you can always go back to pop a pin in those pieces that aren't already adhered to your backing fabric. Now, with our stitching, and again, this is very much a personal thing, I have a little bit of a thing where I like to have straight lines. And so I might use my ruler and, not that one, I have a sew line invisible. I don't know why I keep calling it invisible. Sorry, it is air erasable. If it was invisible, I wouldn't see it. But it's an air erasable pen, and I use that to mark some lines, and that will make sure that my stitching's going to be straight. It will disappear probably in a few hours. It does depend on the heat. The warmer the day, it will disappear more quickly. So if you want it to last for a few hours, it's probably not the best thing. So with your stitching, in much the same way as you would if you were quilting, I would be starting in the middle and working my way to the outside edges. So I'm just going to start on this piece. Now, if we come back to our sample, you'll see that I've got some stitching lines that go across, and I've got some others that will go down. And it's very much a personal matter, completely up to you to decide which way you want to go. You could do them all in straight lines in one direction. You could do a little bit of everything both ways. You could do some on an angle. You don't even need to do this by hand if you don't want to. In this sample that we've done earlier, you'll notice that these stitching lines have actually been done on a sewing machine. Again, quite randomly as to which way they're going. But because I love to hand stitch, I would hand stitch every opportunity that I get. So I might start with this section then, and what I'm going to do is put straight lines down through here. I want my stitching, whichever line I stitch, to be close enough to an edge of the raw edge of each piece of fabric. So I wouldn't just put a line through here and leave that empty. I'd make sure I was stitching close to a line, whichever way I'm going to go. So let's start by just putting in a few, and I'll do them a 1/4 of an inch. And I'm going to stitch that section running in that direction. As I said, you certainly don't need to put in, lines. I just find that my stitching is not altogether perfectly straight, and that's what works for me. So I'm going to get myself some thread, and I will measure it out. In a lot of other hand stitching, I always say, use the length that goes from your fingertip to your elbow, because I dislike having to change the thread all the time. I generally go up to my shoulder when I'm using embroidery floss, and just to separate the threads out before I put them back together to stitch them. Holding them between your thumb and your forefinger, and just pull one thread out at a time. If you keep it tight down here, they won't knot up. And I'm just going to stitch this with 2 threads, or 2 strands of thread. And I'll pop those into my embroidery needle. So with a knot, then I've put a quilter's knot on the bottom of my strands of thread. All I've got, of course, on the bottom is my purlin, and later on in this project it will have some lining on the back. So it doesn't matter that I've just got a knot on the back, because nobody will ever see my knots. All we need to do is a running stitch. And because I've put those lines in there, I'm going to use those lines as my guidelines. Because I've used a nice long needle, I can fit quite a few stitches on that needle before I need to pull it through. Now, if you're having trouble pulling that needle through, I do have quite a few options, such as needle grippers that you just would have one on each finger, and they will pull that needle through for you. But once you've pulled your needle through, you just will need to flatten out that fabric. We don't want it gathering up. And we'll continue down to the end of that row that I put in there. And once again, just flatten it as I go. So moving across then, and I'm going to come back up the next one. Now, I don't need my stitches to be, in the same spot, lined up underneath each other. However, if later on I think I might like to put a stitch going this way, it is easier if I have my little lines lined up, but it's completely up to you. But it's probably easier not to stress about trying to get them lined up. It's very much an individual technique. You do what pleases you. No need for exactitude. Just enjoy the process, and this will take me quite a few hours to sit and stitch. Sometimes it's something that I like to do just while I'm sitting in front of the television at night, or sitting in the car waiting. And, it might be that I will stitch things one way and then I'll come back and stitch across them going in another way. But it's remembering to keep it nice and flat as you go, and continuing on. So I'll do a little bit of this, and then we'll come back and have a look at it again once I've got a bit more done. So we're up to the next day now, and just to clarify, I did say yesterday that it was going to take me quite a few hours to stitch this out, and it was a bit of an exaggeration. I'd say in the end it was probably 2 to 3 hours, but basically as we started off, it is just a straight running stitch, going in some different directions to make a bit of a pattern. And in a couple of spots there I've started to make just some cross stitches. So I'd gone one way and I've just gone back and done the other way. You turn it over on the back, you'll see where I've got my knots, where I've tied my thread off. and it's certainly not tidy by any means, but our lining will go inside and no one will ever know that's what I've done. So just a couple of things. I did end up using the needle grippets, and they're just some little plastic tabs that I popped onto my fingers to help pull the needle through. Some other things that might make that needle pulling a little bit easier include like obviously other tools, like this is another needle gripper as well. If you've got some thread wax, that will make it a little bit easy. But really what will help a lot is if you don't have too many spaces where you've got 3 layers of fabric on top of each other, which is what I had, you know, in some areas. And you can see in this section, you know, that tiny little flower is underneath the purple one, and then this one's on top of that. So I'm really stitching through 3 layers of fabric in my purlin there, which made it a little bit more difficult. Once you get up to stitching 2, you might notice, and I certainly found in this section here, my fabric where I'd laid it out wasn't sitting really on top of it. You know, the 2 pieces weren't overlapping. And so what I did was I used a 3rd piece to put underneath, so if they do end up gaping, you won't see it. The other thing that I've done now I've got it finished is I used the piece of purlin on the back, which was the correct size to start with, and you will see that, you know, my edges are all different sizes, but I just ran around that piece of purlin 1/4 of an inch from the outside edge, so that when I trim this up, and I will trim it up before I put the lining on, it won't unravel the running stitch that I've done with my embroidery threads, because I don't want them to start coming undone. So they are all secured around that outside edge. If you were to have a look at these 2 side by side, you'll notice that this one has a far bigger frayed edge than the sample that we've just finished. And the reason for that is because with each of these pieces I went round and took 2 to 3 threads off each of the sides, as I showed you earlier. With this one, apart from that first one that I demonstrated, the others I didn't touch at all. So these are just completely natural what came. But as I mentioned, I did just cut all the pieces with scissors because I found it a lot easier than tearing the fabric, and then simply made an artificial tearing look by fraying the edges manually. The other thing that I didn't stress enough was that with our Boro, the pieces of fabric are just laid down with their raw edges out, which is quite different to the Kawandi. If you've seen my Kawandi video, where all the edges get turned under. So with Boro, they're all just raw edges, and you can get a different look depending on how much you pull off the edge there. Before I go and put it all together then, I'd like to do the little piece of embroidery, the little flower, embroidered flower that's on the front of that one. Much easier to do and attach it before you've joined it together into a mug rug. Now again, in the pattern, and Natalie's provided us with a cute little drawing, and then if you've purchased a kit from me, you'll have a piece of linen that it needs to be traced onto. The pattern suggests using a permanent marker or a mechanical pencil. Personally, I prefer not to use a permanent marker, and you can get some beautiful ones in fine point, and if you're happy to use that, that's good. For me, if I make a mistake, I'm stuck, and inevitably, you know, I'm halfway through and realise I've done something wrong. So I do prefer to use a pencil, and I've got a Soline pencil, and if I make a mistake, it's easy enough to rub it out. Of course, there are many other marking pens that we can use, but because we're going to iron a stabiliser, and that will be in your kit as well, onto the back of your piece of linen, there's no point in using a friction pen to trace out the design, because as soon as you press your stabiliser to the back, the heat will remove the drawing. So just think about what you use before you draw it and then lose your drawing. So with my embroidery, and again, in the kit I've supplied you with some threads that will coordinate with the kit that you've chosen. I like to use for embroidery a stitchery needle that has come from Hugs and Kisses. It's actually a size 7 crewel needle, and if you have a Kawandi kit, it would be the needle that I've enclosed in that. It's not as long as the needle, the Sashiko needle that we've used to do our stitching here, but I love this needle for embroidery. It's, as I said, it's not as long, so it's more easily manageable, especially around the corners. However, I do find that it's easy enough to thread, put 2 strands of embroidery floss through it, but if it comes to 3, then I'm usually left having to use a needle threader, and I like to keep things simple, so I tend to use 2 strands for that reason. I mean, you could have used it definitely to do the stitching, but as I said, it's just not quite as long, and so you won't fit as many stitches on your running stitch at the same time. So just while I've got you here, I have frayed the edges on my piece of linen because, as I did with this one, I'm just going to do a running stitch so it fits in with the running stitch and the frayed edges of the rest of it. However, you could, turn it under and do a blind stitch, or you could sew it on with the sewing machine, whichever way you prefer. But while I've got you here, I'm just going to show you how to do a lacy daisy stitch, because that's all I've done here with these flowers and these leaves. So I've come up through the bottom, and then I'm bringing it out to the length of the petal and going back in where I started, and then I'm going to bring my needle through where my finger is at the end of the petal. So I've made a loop, pull it through, and where this thread is coming out up here is going to stop that from going back. And then I'll just put my needle back down through there. And you can use that stitch for your leaves, or you can also use that stitch, and again I'd have a different colour thread, but it also works just as well for those petals, so for the heart-shaped petals. So coming up into the shape of your loop, and I just hold that up there with my finger, needle back down through where I started, and coming up at the tip of the petal, keeping it nice and straight, and then down, and then the other side of the heart shape here. The other one that I'll show you while we're here is this little stem stitch, and how I've filled in that, not a stem stitch, sorry, used a stem stitch on my stem there, a satin stitch, and that's the way I've filled in that heart. And to do that, I'm just doing a little back stitch around the outline of the heart. So come up in front and then go back, which is why it's called a back stitch, and then come up just a little distance in front, and then going back into the hole that I've come out of down there. And we're just, as you get round these corners, you're just going to need some tiny little stitches so that it keeps its shape. But I find when I do the satin stitch that it gives it a nice finish if you've got the outline done first, because it gives it something for those stitches to sit up on, so it will give it a bit of a lift for you. So coming back into the centre then of that heart shape, I turn it around, you'll see I've got my heart there. And starting in the centre, I'm just going to come, because that's the biggest point, and I'd like my heart to go, the stitches to go straight down there. I'm going to come up there and go down in the bottom of the heart. And I'm going to work from there out each side. So beside that, I'll do my next stitch straight down and over the edge of that back stitch. Pushing it so it's there together, and the next one will go beside that. And so that's how I would do that, just go straight across to the other side. So what I'll do now is finish off my stitching. I'll finish making up the mug bag, and I'll come back and show you what it looks like when it's all put together. Before I pulled my sewing machine out to finish off the project, I still had my needle and thread embroidery floss in my hand. I put the lining on the back of my stitched piece, and I used that embroidery floss to run a couple of rows of running stitch down the length of the back of it. Now the pattern does say that you could put your lining on the back and stitch through all 3 layers at once, but you saw the back of my piece, the back of the purlin, and it was messy, and it's not a look that I'd like to have inside. So I put my lining on separately and used those running stitches to hold it down. I've just stitched through the lining and the purlin, not through to the front. And because I like to stitch, there was no problem at all. The other thing I'll show you is that you'll recall I made the blue one a little bit bigger, and if we put them side by side, you'll just see there's a little difference there. The instructions in the pattern, or the measurements, will make this size bag, and it is a nice size bag. It will hold a decent sized teacup or a coffee mug, and if I put that in there and do it up, you'll see that it is nice and secure. So that won't go anywhere, and it's handy to take along. However, if you think you might have an extra large size mug, I do recommend that you have a think about that first, and simply with a few extra adjustments, so a little extra length or a little extra width, and increasing the size of the gusset, you can make your mug bag a little bit bigger. We do have the kits available in both colourways. This one I'm calling blue, and this one I haven't decided yet whether it's pink or yellow, but you'll see that on our website as well. The kits contain everything that you'll need to make the project except for a needle. I do hope that you've enjoyed learning about Boro with me, and you might give it a try on whether it's a mug bag or on any other project that you're going to be making, especially if you like just doing a bit of simple hand stitching, which is quite relaxing. Thank you again so much for joining with me, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. In the meantime, though, I think it must be time for a cup of tea.